I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, kindly donate. My PayPal link is in the description. It began with a dare, as most reckless things often do. After school, a group of teenagers ventured beyond the town's boundaries to a long-forgotten graveyard, a place shrouded in mystery and the ghost stories their parents had used to frighten them as children. The graveyard lay abandoned for decades, hidden beneath a tangled mess of overgrowth, tombstones cracked and crumbling under centuries of neglect. It was a place the locals avoided, a place steeped in an unsettling, lingering silence. Nate Carter, a 17-year-old thrill-seeker with a reputation for fearless stunts, led the group that day. Armed with shovels and flashlights, they weaved through the shadows of the tombstones, their breath heavy with excitement. The air around them grew unnaturally cold as they neared the heart of the cemetery, a gnarled oak tree that seemed to claw at the sky. "This is it," Nate said, his voice wavering with anticipation. "The spot where Old Man Ashmore was buried. Why do you even believe that legend?" Jenna asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. She crossed her arms, watching Nate dig. "Everyone knows it's just a creepy story." But Nate was undeterred. He had heard the stories, about how Ashmore was not just a man, but a sorcerer. They said he was buried with a cursed amulet, one that could call upon spirits from the underworld. And if the rumors were true, the amulet granted unimaginable power to anyone who dared to wield it. Of course, none of Nate's friends believed the story, but Nate wasn't one to back down from a challenge. If nothing else, it would make for a great story later. Nate drove his shovel into the earth, the sound of metal on stone causing the group to flinch. Minutes passed, and then hours, as he dug deeper. His friends grew restless, teasing him, urging him to give up. But then, with a heavy thud, Nate's ancient chest lay buried beneath layers of dirt. Its wood was dark, almost black, and in the moonlight, the chest seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. Nate wiped the sweat from his brow and pried the chest open. Inside, resting on a bed of rotting velvet, was the amulet. It was a crude piece, made of black iron, its surface engraved with strange, unholy symbols. In the center was a crimson gem that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Nate's fingers brushed against it, and a shock of cold rushed up his arm. He hesitated for a moment but then smiled. "See?" Nate grinned, holding up the amulet. "I told you this was real." "Let's get out of here," Jenna urged, her voice tense. Something about the amulet unsettled her, as if the air around it had grown thicker, darker. The others murmured their agreement, unease spreading through the group, but Nate was already slipping the amulet into his pocket, ignoring the growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, but he chalked it up to adrenaline. They laughed, brushing off the discomfort as they made their way out of the cemetery, completely unaware of what they had just unleashed. The first sign that something was wrong came that very night. Nate lay in bed, the amulet resting on his nightstand. He tossed and turned, struggling to sleep. Whenever his eyes closed, he heard whispers, indistinct at first, like the wind passing through the trees. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent, as if something just outside his window was calling his name. Nate sat up, his skin crawling with a strange sensation. The room was bathed in shadow, but everything felt wrong. The darkness seemed to move, twisting unnaturally, forming shapes that flickered in and out of his vision. He glanced at the amulet, the crimson gem glowing faintly, casting a sickly. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just fatigue. But when he opened them again, a figure stood at the foot of his bed. It was barely human, an emaciated form draped in tattered robes, its skin gray and stretched tight over skeletal limbs. Hollow eyes stared at him, and a grotesque smile twisted its lips. The air around Nate grew colder, and he could smell decay, like rotting flesh. For a moment, he couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, trapped by the creature's gaze. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at him, its bony fingers reaching for his throat. Nate screamed, scrambling out of bed, knocking over the nightstand in his haste. The amulet clattered to the floor, and as soon as it did, the figure vanished. Gasping for breath, Nate stared at the empty space where it had been. His heart raced, and sweat drenched his skin. "It's just a nightmare," he whispered to himself, clutching his chest. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, things grew worse. The whispers followed Nate everywhere, at school, in the hallways, even when he was surrounded by people. Shadows seemed to cling to him, distorting reality. Sometimes, when he glanced in the mirror, he saw something lurking behind him, watching. And it wasn't just Nate who was affected. Jenna noticed it first. She hadn't been able to shake the uneasy feeling since the night they dug up the amulet. Strange things had been happening to her as well, doors creaking open on their own, objects moving just out of the corner of her eye. And the nightmares. Every night, she saw the same figure that Nate had. Only, it whispered her name, calling her to join it in the dark. The others began to experience it too. Ryan and Max saw things, heard things. They tried to brush it off as paranoia, but they knew something had followed them home from that graveyard. Nate, desperate for answers, returned to the cemetery alone. He needed to know what they had disturbed, what kind of tree. A familiar coldness washed over him. The ground beneath the tree was torn apart, as if something had crawled out from the earth. A gust of wind carried a whisper to his ear. "You should not have taken it." He froze, looking around. The cemetery was deserted, but he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. Trembling, Nate pulled the amulet from his pocket. The crimson gem glowed brighter now, pulsing with a life of its own. "What do you want?" Nate shouted into the wind. "Your soul," the voice hissed. "The amulet has chosen you." Nate's stomach dropped. The whispers were no longer distant, they were inside his head, gnawing at his thoughts. He gripped the amulet tightly. But as he did, the cold spread through his body. His fingers began to numb, and when he looked down, his skin was turning gray, like the creature he had seen in his bedroom. Panic gripped him, and he yanked the amulet off, tossing it to the ground. But it was too late. The darkness had already begun to consume him. The line between reality and nightmare shattered for Nate. The shadows became more than just illusions, they had substance, crawling along the walls like living things. Faces emerged from the darkness, twisted and deformed, whispering promises of torment and death. Every time he closed his eyes, the creature returned, closer now, its bony fingers scraping across his skin. Its breath cold against his neck. Nate stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. His friends tried to intervene, but they, too, were trapped in the grip of the curse. Jenna's hair had begun to fall out in clumps, her skin pale and sickly. Ryan had lost his ability to speak, his voice stolen by the whispers. Max had gone missing altogether. One by one, they fell victim to the amulet's power, their lives spiraling out of control as the entity grew too late. That the amulet wasn't just cursed, it was a beacon, a doorway that allowed something ancient and malevolent to cross into their world. And now that it was here, it wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. Nate knew there was only one way to end it. He had to return the amulet to its resting place, to the grave where it belonged. But as he approached the cemetery for the last time, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The earth cracked open, and from the fissures, ghostly hands clawed their way out, reaching for him. The entity was no longer just a haunting presence. It had manifested fully, a towering figure of darkness, eyes glowing red with malice. It stood between Nate and the grave, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said. "Your soul is mine." Nate gripped the amulet, his hand trembling. "I'll die before I let you take it," he spat, and with a surge of adrenaline, he charged at the figure, shoving the amulet into its chest. The entity's scream reverberated through the night, splitting the air like the crack of thunder. Nate watched in horror as its form shifted and contorted, its shadowy limbs twisting in agony. The amulet embedded in its chest began to glow brighter, the crimson light pulsing like a grotesque heart. But instead of weakening the creature, the light grew darker, and the atmosphere around them turned suffocatingly thick with dread. The ground beneath Nate split further, yawning open like the jaws of some monstrous beast. Cold, fetid air rushed from the chasm, carrying with it the stench of rotten death. Nate stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the jagged edges of the fissure. From below, shapes moved in the darkness, indistinct figures writhing and clawing, moaning in torment. The amulet wasn't destroying the entity. It bulged grotesquely, flesh twisting and splitting as it grew larger, its red eyes glowing brighter with every passing moment. Nate realized with a sinking horror that he had made a fatal mistake. The amulet was never meant to be returned. It was a conduit, a key to the underworld, and by bringing it back to the graveyard, he had opened a door that couldn't be closed. "I should have never taken it," Nate whispered to himself, his voice shaking with terror. The creature turned its gaze on him, its hollow eyes burning with malice. Its once human form had morphed into something truly monstrous, its skin hanging in ragged, decayed strips, its bones jutting out at impossible angles. And yet, despite its grotesque appearance, it still wore that same sickening, twisted smile. "You cannot escape," the creature hissed, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You belong to me now." Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The fissure had widened, cutting off his path to safety. Desperate, he searched for a way out, his mind racing. His only chance was to find a way to destroy the amulet before it consumed him, and everyone else. But how? Behind him, the figures in the chasm began to crawl upward, their skeletal hands reaching for him, pulling themselves out of the darkness. Their faces were hollow, gaunt, their mouths twisted open in silent screams. Nate's skin crawled as they drew closer, their bony fingers scraping across the ground, pulling them toward him. "No. No." Nate screamed, his voice cracking as he kicked at one of the figures, its icy grip locking around his ankle. He fell to the ground, his body trembling with fear as more of the creatures emerged from the abyss. They surrounded him, their lifeless eyes staring through him, their mouths moving silently as though whispering forgotten words. The cold of their touch seeped into his bones, and Nate's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He darted back to the amulet, still glowing in the chest of the creature. He had to destroy it, but how? It was iron, and something told him no ordinary means would work. It was ancient, forged in a time when rituals were performed in blood and forbidden knowledge was whispered in the dark. Suddenly, a thought flickered in his mind, one of the symbols engraved on the amulet. He had seen it before, in one of the old books he had stumbled upon during his research. The book had been filled with arcane rituals and cryptic notes about ancient relics. One passage stood out to him now, its meaning hauntingly clear. "Only fire from the abyss can unmake the cursed." Fire. Nate's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. He had to burn the amulet with a fire born from the very underworld it had come from. But how could he summon such a fire? His gaze shifted to the chasm, the shadows swirling within it, the moaning wails of the lost souls growing louder. Without hesitating, Nate crawled toward the edge of the fissure. The creatures grabbed at him, their hands cold as death, their voices whispering promises of torment. But Nate pushed forward, ignoring the terror clawing at his mind. He needed fire, and the only place he could find it was in the very abyss itself. as he neared the edge, a blast of cold air hit him, stinging his face and numbing his limbs. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, nearly making him gag. But beneath that foul odor, he could smell something else: sulfur. A foul, acrid scent that filled him with both dread and hope. He leaned over the edge, staring into the darkness below. For a moment, there was nothing but shadow, the pit seemingly bottomless. But then, deep within the abyss, he saw it, a faint flicker of flame, glowing in the blackness like a tiny ember. It was small, but it was enough. Do it. A voice whispered from behind him, low. The creature, its body towering over him now, its grotesque form pulsing with dark energy. Its smile had widened, its jagged teeth gleaming in the faint light of the amulet. The ground shook beneath them, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around the creature as if feeding off its power. Take the fire, Nate. The voice urged, seductive and cold. Take it, and burn away your fear. Burn away your soul. The temptation gnawed at Nate's mind, but he shook it off. He wasn't doing this for the creature, he was doing it to end the nightmare. To save himself and his friends from the horror they had unleashed. With a deep breath, Nate lowered his hand into the chasm, reaching for the flame. The cold bit into his skin, and the whispers from the abyss grew louder, filling his head with thoughts of despair and madness. But he pressed on, stretching his fingers toward the tiny ember of fire. As his hand brushed against it, a searing pain shot through his arm, and Nate screamed in agony. The fire from the abyss was unlike anything he had ever felt, cold and hot at the same time, burning his flesh even as it chilled his bones. But he held on, gritting his teeth as he drew the flame closer. With a final, desperate lunge, Nate pulled the flame from the chasm. It clung to his hand like molten metal, burning with an intensity that made his skin blister and crack. But as he held it, the flame grew, twisting and spiraling in his palm, until it formed a ball of flickering, hellish light. Nate stumbled to his feet, his breath ragged and his hand shaking from the pain. The creature watched him, its smile faltering as it realized what he held. No. It hissed, its voice trembling with fury. You will not defy me. Nate didn't hesitate. With a shout of defiance, he hurled the flame at the amulet. The fire struck the crimson gem, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then, all at once, the amulet exploded out an ear-piercing scream as the fire consumed it, its body writhing in agony as the flames tore through its flesh. The shadows around it twisted and evaporated, and the ground beneath them shook violently as the fissure began to close. Nate watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the creature's form crumbled to ash, its monstrous scream fading into nothingness. The amulet melted in the fire, the iron turning to liquid as the cursed relic was finally destroyed. For a moment, there was only silence. The abyss had closed, and the cemetery was still once more. The air was no longer thick with dread, and the cold that had gripped Nate's bones was gone. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His hand throbbed with pain, the skin blackened and burned from the fire. But it was over. The nightmare was finally over. In the days that followed, the town remained eerily quiet. The graveyard was untouched, the fissure sealed as though it had never existed. Nate's friends, those who had survived the curse, slowly recovered, though the horrors they had experienced would haunt them forever. But for Nate, the ordeal had left a deeper scar. His hand, burned by the fire from the abyss, never healed. The flesh remained charred, blackened, as if marked by the very flames of hell. He could feel something in his bones, something dark and cold, remnant of the abyss that had taken root in his soul. Nate knew that the amulet was gone, but its curse had not been lifted. The darkness had taken something from him, something he could never get back. He had destroyed the creature, but at what cost? In the quiet of his room, Nate would often hear the faintest whisper, just beyond the edge of his hearing. It was a voice he had grown all too familiar with, a voice that promised power, but at a terrible price. "You will return to me," it would whisper, soft as a lover's breath. "You belong." Nate knew the voice was right. The curse had been broken, but the abyss was still there, waiting. And one day, it would call him back. Weeks passed, but Nate's sense of unease never faded. Sleep became a distant memory as the voice, the haunting whisper from the abyss, lingered in his mind. It was soft at first, like the wind passing through a crack in the window. But soon, it became persistent, rising in intensity, and gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Each night, the voice would grow louder, calling him back to the graveyard. Back to the cursed amulet that should have been destroyed but still seemed to have its claws in him. He tried to shut it out, turning up the volume on his music or drowning himself in mindless TV shows. But nothing worked. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. One night, as Nate lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, the voice took on a form. He saw her, the spirit. The same monstrous entity he had thought destroyed, but now more human in appearance, though still marked by the grotesque signs of decay. Her hollow, blackened eyes stared at him from the corner of his room, her lips parted in that familiar, sinister smile. "You cannot escape," she whispered, her voice like the scraping of bones. "You will return." Nate bolted upright, his body drenched in sweat. He blinked, but the figure remained, standing by his bed, her form flickering as though caught between this world and the next. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear and frustration. He reached for the lamp beside his bed, but when the light flickered on, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, save for the quiet hum of the night. But the voice remained, echoing in his mind. Nate had thought he had one. That destroying the amulet would free him from the nightmare. But now, he understood, he hadn't broken the curse. He had only delayed it. The next morning, Nate examined it. From the fire of the abyss had healed, but the skin remained blackened and cracked, as if something was still eating away at it beneath the surface. The mark throbbed constantly, a dull, burning sensation that never left him. It was as if the abyss had left a piece of itself in him, a reminder of what awaited. "Shit." Nate muttered to himself, running cold water over his hand, hoping to numb the pain. He avoided his friends. He avoided his family. He didn't want to talk about what had happened, didn't want to relive the horrors of that night. But more than that, he didn't want them to see the changes in him. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded with dark thoughts he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the abyss. The writhing shadows, the skeletal hands reaching up from the chasm, and the figures, those twisted, tormented souls, clawing their way toward him. The voice never stopped. It was always there, whispering promises of power, of escape, of freedom from the torment that gnawed at his mind. But Nate knew better. He had seen what the abyss could do. He had felt its pull. If he gave in, he would be lost forever, but the line between reality and nightmare was fading fast. Strange things began happening around him. His shadow moved when he stood still, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Doors would creak open by themselves, and he could hear the faintest whispers in the dark. Voices calling his name. One evening, as Nate sat at his desk, trying in vain to distract himself with schoolwork, the lights flickered. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping until he could see his breath. The voice returned, louder this time. "You belong to me," it whispered, the word sending shivers down Nate's spine. He jumped to his feet, knocking over the chair as he scanned the room. Nothing. But the cold remained, pressing in on him like a suffocating fog. His heart raced as he backed a doorknob. A loud bang echoed through the room. Nate whirled around, his breath catching in his throat. The closet door had flown open, revealing nothing but darkness within. "Come." Back. The voice hissed, emanating from the black void of the closet. Nate's pulse pounded in his ears. The darkness in the closet seemed alive, shifting and swirling like the abyss itself. He stepped backward, panic gripping him. He had to get out. He had to escape, but before he could turn to leave, something slithered out of the closet, a tendril of darkness, curling across the floor toward him. Nate froze in place, his legs refusing to move as the shadow stretched closer. Its inky form snaking toward his feet. With a burst of adrenaline, Nate bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the hallway. He slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't keep running. The entity was coming for him, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him. There was only one place left to go. The night was pitch black as Nate made his way back to the graveyard. He had avoided it for weeks, knowing that returning would only invite more horror. But now, he had no choice. Whatever curse had been unleashed that night wasn't finished with him. And if he didn't confront it, it would consume him. The graveyard was silent, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Nate's footsteps echoed as he walked past the rusted iron gates, his flashlight flickering in the gloom. He could feel it, the presence, the cold, malevolent energy that had followed him ever since that night. The ground where the fissure had opened was still scarred, though the chasm itself was gone. Nate knelt down, running his hand over the dirt. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with asked behind him. Nate froze, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly, he turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was the figure of the entity, no longer monstrous, but fully human in appearance. Her eyes were black, hollow pits, and her skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over her bones. "You're not real," Nate whispered, stepping backward. "You're dead. I destroyed the amulet." The entity smiled, her lips curling into that same twisted grin. The amulet was never the source of the curse. It was only a doorway. You opened it, Nate. You let me in. Nate's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The amulet hadn't been the curse itself. It had been a conduit, a means of summoning something far worse. And now, that thing was free, tethered to him, feeding off his fear, growing stronger every day. "What do you want?" Nate demanded, his voice shaking. The entity stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I want what was promised to me. Your soul. Your suffering. You cannot run from this, Nate. You belong to the abyss now." Nate's hands trembled as he backed away, but the entity moved with him, her presence overwhelming. The shadows around them seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting, reaching out with dark tendrils that curled around Nate's feet. "You are mine," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against glass. Nate tried to move, but the shadows held him in place, their grip tightening around his legs. Panic surged through him as the darkness crept higher, crawling up his body, wrapping around his chest, his throat. He couldn't breathe. The entity stood over him, her eyes glowing with a sickening light. "There is no escape. The abyss hungers, and it will have you." Nate's vision blurred as the darkness closed in, the cold suffocating him. His mind raced, searching for a way out, for any means of fighting back. But there was nothing but the endless void pulling him down into the abyss. Then, through the haze of fear and pain, Nate remembered the fire. The fire from the abyss, the one thing that had harmed the entity before. But how could he summon it again? He didn't have the amulet, didn't have any way to call upon that power, unless... Nate's hand shot to the scar on his arm, the mark left by the fire. It still burned, the pain a constant reminder of what he had touched. Desperation fueled him as he dug his nails. Air rippled with heat, and the fire erupted from Nate's skin in a burst of cold flame, scorching through the shadows that had bound him. The shrieks of the entity filled the night, the sound inhuman, like metal grinding against bone. Her form twisted and writhed as the flames licked at her pale, decaying skin, her once human shape flickering like a dying candle. Nate screamed in both agony and fury as the flames consumed everything around him. His arm throbbed with pain, the scar on his hand now glowing with an unholy light. He could feel the abyss pulling at him, the flames that burned within him threatening to drag him back into the void. But he had no choice. If he let go, if he allowed the entity to regain her strength, he would be lost forever. The graveyard around him seemed to warp and distort, the tombstones bending and cracking as the flames spread, casting grotesque shadows against the crumbling statues. The fire wasn't just consuming the physical world, it was burning through the thin veil between life and death, reality and nightmare. Nate could feel it, could sense the boundaries between the two realms disintegrating, the abyss bleeding through into the world. Stop. The entity's voice was no longer seductive, no longer whispering promises of power. It was a scream of raw desperation, filled with the terror of something far older than Nate could comprehend. You don't know what you're doing. But Nate didn't care. He pushed harder, feeding the flames with every ounce of his rage, his fear, his hatred. He could feel the power surging through him, wild and uncontrollable. The cold fire coiled around his body, crackling with a life of its own as it climbed higher, engulfing his arms, his chest, his face. He was becoming the fire, becoming a conduit for the same ancient force that had been locked within the amulet. Staggered backward, her form disintegrating in the inferno. Her once beautiful face crumbled, her skin blackening and falling away in flakes of ash. But even as she burned, her eyes never left Nate's, those hollow pits still filled with an ancient hunger. You think this will save you? She spat, her voice ragged, filled with venom. You think you can burn me away and be free? Nate gritted his teeth, the flames roaring around him. He didn't respond. His mind was slipping, lost in the fire, in the power. He could feel the abyss calling to him, its endless void yawning beneath his feet. But he had no other choice. He had to end this. He had to destroy her before she consumed him. Before she dragged him down into the darkness forever, the entity let out one final scream as the fire engulfed her completely. Her body crumbled, collapsing into a pile of ash at Nate's feet. For a moment, there was silence, nothing but the crackle of the cold flames as they devoured the last remnants of her form. But then, from the ashes, something stirred, a low, guttural growl filled the air, and Nate's heart stopped. He staggered backward, the fire flickering around him as the ground beneath him began to tremble. The ashes swirled, coalescing into a dark, writhing mass that rose from the earth like a shadow-given form. The entity was gone, but the abyss remained. The writhing mass of shadows grew, stretching up from the earth, its form ever changing, never solid. Nate could feel the cold tendrils of its presence reaching out, brushing against his skin like the touch of a corpse. It was ancient, far older than the entity, far older than the amulet. It was the abyss itself, awakened by the power Nate had unleashed. The fire burned hotter around him, but it was no longer enough. The abyss was everywhere, consuming everything in its path. Nate could feel it seeping into him, crawling into his mind. Blurred, the world around him dissolving into a haze of shadows and flame. Nate stumbled backward, his hands clawing at the air as the abyss closed in. He could feel the pull of it, the weight of its emptiness dragging him down. It wanted him, wanted to consume him, to take him into its depths where there was no escape. The flames that had once protected him flickered, growing weaker. Nate's body shook with exhaustion, his mind unraveling as the darkness crept closer. Then, a voice cut through the chaos, a whisper, soft and familiar. Nate, his heart skipped a beat. The voice was faint, barely audible over the roar of the abyss, but he recognized it. It wasn't the entity's voice. It was his mother's, Nate. "Come home." Tears welled up in his eyes as the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was impossible, he knew that. His mother was gone. She had died years ago, taken from him in a car accident that had left him hollow inside. But now, her voice was here, calling to him through the void, "Nate, please. Come home." His chest tightened as the shadows pressed in around him, the fire sputtering out. He was losing the battle. The abyss was too strong. But his mother's voice, it pulled at him, anchored him to the world he was slipping away from. With one final burst of strength, Nate closed his eyes and reached out into the darkness. He didn't know where he was reaching. Didn't know if there was anything left to hold on to. But he had to try. He had to believe that there was still something, someone, waiting for him on the other side. His fingers brushed against something cold and solid, the amulet. It lay there, half buried in the dirt, the metal still pulsing with an eerie light. The artifact that had started everything, the cursed object that had dragged him into this nightmare. But now, as Nate gripped it in his hand, he realized what he had to do. The abyss recoiled, the shadows flinching as the amulet flared to look for the abyss. It was a prison. And Nate, in his desperation, had just found the key. With a scream of defiance, Nate lifted the amulet high, channeling all of his fear, his rage, his grief into the object. The light from the amulet exploded outward, piercing through the darkness, the fire roaring to life once again. The abyss screamed, the ground shook violently as the shadows were pulled back, sucked into the amulet's core. The writhing mass of darkness twisted and contorted, trying to resist, but the light was too strong. Nate held on with everything he had, his body trembling as the power surged through him. The abyss roared, the sound deafening, but slowly. Agonizingly, it began to recede. The shadows melted away, drawn back into the amulet's depths, leaving nothing but the charred remains of the graveyard behind. And then, with a final, earth-shattering crack, the abyss was gone. Nate collapsed to the ground, the amulet slipping from his hand. He lay there for what felt like hours, his chest heaving, his body aching with exhaustion. The cold night air pressed in around him, but for the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight of the abyss was gone. He had done it. He had won. The entity was destroyed, the abyss sealed once again. But as Nate lay there in the dirt, staring up at the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The graveyard was too quiet, too still. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ash and smoke in its wake. And the amulet, the cursed object that had caused so much pain, now lay beside him, its glow dim and lifeless. Nate picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The metal was cold, the intricate symbols etched into its surface barely visible in the moonlight. But as he held it, he felt a faint tremor beneath his skin, a reminder that the abyss was still there, waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. He had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The abyss wasn't gone. It had simply been sealed away, waiting for the next fool to come along and unleash it. Nate stood, his body trembling with exhaustion. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the abyss would return, if the entity would find a way to claw its way back into the world. But for now, he was free. For now, he had survived. He turned and walked away from the graveyard, the amulet still clutched tightly in his hand. The shadows stretched long behind him, whispering in the wind, but Nate didn't look back. The weeks that followed felt like a strange dream. Nate returned to his life, but nothing was the same. He avoided the graveyard, avoided the people who asked too many questions. But the whispers never truly left him. At night, when the world was quiet, he would hear them, soft, distant, but always there. One evening, as Nate sat in his room, he noticed something. The mark on his arm, the scar left by the fire, was changing. It was no longer just a blackened burn. The skin was shifting, the lines forming into strange, intricate symbols, symbols that looked eerily familiar.